Welcome back to Filling in the History. I am the amateur historian coming back at you, and we're going to be talking about some early church history through the Joseph Smith papers. I also should say, I should apologize here for a little bit. We're in December of 1831. I'm going to figure out which year we're in eventually. And just so you know, we've been in Documents Volume 2 for a while. So this actually starts in the middle of the summer of 1831. And we're now at the end of 1831. So this year has been enormous. Almost every section of the Doctrine and Covenants that we've had up to this point has been from the year 1831. So this is a gargantuan year. It's coming to a close. We're going to hit it with section 72 today. But just kind of wanted to let you know where we are in the Joseph Smith papers. So we have more or less completed what's called Histories Volume 1. We've come through a large portion of Histories Volume 2. Documents Volume 1, Revelations and Translations Volume 1. We've gone through the Revelation books that are in there. And there's quite a few things that we've actually covered in the actual papers themselves. I realize that this podcast and these episodes have turned into more or less kind of an audiobook for the Joseph Smith papers, so I hope it's been very helpful to you. And today we're going to be talking about sections 71 through 75 and closing out 1831. And one thing that I enjoy about this too is Revelation Book 2, which we've been sort of tapping into a little bit, technically begins, like the first thing you see there is section 76. So we're really making some pretty big progress here. Now there's 138 sections of the Latter-day Saint Doctrine and Covenants. So we're getting into sort of the halfway mark here of the whole project. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. And we're going to dive in now to section 71. So this one's kind of a weird one. There's this whole stack that we're talking about here, 71 through 75. Section 74 is going to get its own part. But part 1 here, we're going to be talking about basically a set of revelations that were just found in a loose stack of papers. They were folded up in such a way that you could totally put it into your pocket. And it looks like what happened here was that Sidney Rigdon wrote down a bunch of these, handed them to Newell K. Whitney. He would carry them with him as part of his duties as a bishop in the church. And most of these revelations that we get in this episode today are going to be from this loose stack, which is kind of interesting. So in some cases, we are actually looking, finally, this is very rare we get to do this, we are actually looking at the most original version of a revelation. This is extremely rare, so very, very special. These Newell K. Whitney papers were actually donated to the church's university, Brigham Young University, back from, I think it was like 1968 to 1974. In that stack, there was this family headed by a man named Isaac Grew, who donated these to the BYU library, and that's where we get them from. So a very special day today. We actually get to see the original document. So let's get into it. This is a loose stack of papers, I said before, handwriting of Sidney Rigdon. On the recto of a page, remember verso and recto? I don't know if you do, but anyway, that's a thing in the document world. On the recto of the page, you can see it has some other revelations. You can actually kind of see the ink bleeding through the page here. And like I said, there's a whole stack that we're going to get to today. So that is the most original version that we have of section 71. Revelation Book 1 also has a copy of this. It's the handwriting of John Whitmer. We get a lot of verse numbering and not really much other changes by W.W. Phelps in preparation for making it into a published volume. We also get a copy in Revelation Book 2, and this is the handwriting of Frederick G. Williams, and it's a pretty clean copy, so no other corrections there. It is section 90 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, and we find a version of this in the manuscript history of the church. And the reason why I bring that up is because the whole purpose of this next section, which is, are there any differences between the 1981 version of the Doctrine and Covenants and the 2013 section headings, is because of that manuscript history version. That's where the 1981 scriptures used to come from. So when the Joseph Smith papers came out and some other things that were researched, the 2013 version of the Doctrine and Covenants changed those section headings. In some cases did not. In this case, did not. No differences between 1981 and 2013. So some circumstantial introductions into section 71. The original paperwork that we have simply says Hiram, Portage County, Ohio. December 1st, 1831. That's all you get. Revelation Book 2, Hiram, Portage County, Ohio, December 1st, 1832, which is the wrong year. That's okay. Scribal error of that year is 1832, which means that Fred might have been writing this down in 1832. So a little mistake. I do it sometimes. It's okay. We will forgive Fred for this. Revelation Book 1 gives us, it's number 82, by the way, a revelation to Joseph and Sidney Rigdon given Hiram, Portage County, Ohio, December 1st, 1831. So that date is correct. Not much given in the Doctrine and Covenants. And in the manuscript history, we get a little more, thankfully. It says, after Oliver Cowdery and John Whitmer had departed for Jackson County, Missouri, I resumed the translation of the scriptures and continued to labor in this branch of my calling with Elder Sidney Rigdon as my scribe until, and this is all scratched out, the first day of December, when I received the following. And there you go. So what do we get from the historical introduction? From Documents Volume 2, we get, after holding several conferences early in November regarding the publication of the Revelations, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation on 1st of December 1831, directing the Lord's servants to proclaim the gospel in the regions round about for the space of a season. Later copies of this revelation identified the servants as Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. This revelation directed Joseph Smith and Rigdon to pave the way for the publication of the revelations through preaching. The need to preach seems to have grown more urgent because of the actions of Ezra Booth in Sidman's Writer, who had begun to antagonize the church. A conference of elders, including Joseph Smith, disciplined Booth on the 6th of September, 1831, so a few months before. And in October, the Ravenna, Ohio newspaper, Ohio Star, began publishing Booth's letters criticizing Joseph Smith and the Church of Christ. The issue of the Ohio Star, published shortly before this revelation was dictated, printed Booth's 7th letter, which included a message to Edward Partridge. Booth counseled Partridge to place yourself from under the influence of the men who have deceived you, and to fly from the habitations haunted by impostors. Very strong language. Now, ironically, Ezra Booth's letters and some of the things that he did in the Ravenna newspaper and other things are actually pretty valuable to church historians. So, thank you, Ezra, for that. There's always a way to make things useful, I suppose. Further to this, we get a couple months earlier, Ryder, who had also become disaffected, provided a copy of the February 1831 revelation titled Laws of the Church of Christ to the Western Courier, another Ravenna newspaper, stating that the prophets or preachers declare it to be a law revealed to them from heaven. Ryder requested that the newspaper publish the revelation, noting that church leaders were commanded not to communicate it to the world, or even to their followers, until they become strong in the faith. Ryder later declared that new converts could learn from these materials that a plot was laid to take their property from them and place it under the control of Joseph Smith the prophet. This 1st December revelation instructed Joseph Smith and Rigdon to counteract the work of such enemies. So, to kind of point this out, I think there's a lot of very logical arguments here. This law of consecration was very new. This idea of giving property over to the church and that it would be controlled through Newell K. Whitney and others is if you don't understand it, it definitely seems a little weird. So, these are definitely legitimate arguments. And what's interesting about this, and this is not something that I believe is usually encouraged by the church today, but we get a little bit of a challenge thrown down, which says, and this is from the historical introduction again, in response to these criticisms and prompted by the revelation, Rigdon invited Booth to a lecture in Ravenna on the 25th of December, where he would review Booth's letters and show them to be an unfair and false representation of the subjects on which they treat. Rigdon also challenged Ryder to a public debate on the Book of Mormon. Both men declined Rigdon's invitations, Rigdon still lectured in Ravenna against Booth's letters, and he and Joseph Smith preached in Shalersville and other places, setting forth the truth. So what's interesting, and I really appreciate this, it's like, yeah, okay, let's take your letters and let's talk about it. And over here, you got a problem with the Book of Mormon, let's have a debate about it in front of everybody. Now, we don't usually throw down challenges like that. I think the church today it is enormously adverse to any sort of contentious behavior or any sort of challenge-like behavior. But I thought this was an interesting one of like, you know what? You published it. Let's talk about it. Let's get everybody together and actually chat about it. They didn't take that challenge, which I find very interesting. It was also on Christmas Day, so there's that. But Rigdon preached anyway, so I thought that was a very interesting story. Some content and footnotes from this revelation. The text gives us, from the revelation itself, "Verily I say unto you, proclaim unto the world in the regions round about, and in the church also, for the space of a season, even until it shall be made known unto you." Footnote 3 to this says, "A later Joseph Smith history indicates that he and Sidney Rigdon preached in Shalersville, Ravenna, and other places in response to these instructions." So they definitely spread out and sort of preached everywhere that they could. The text further gives to us, "Now behold, this is wisdom. Whoso readeth, let him understand, and receive also. For unto him who receiveth it shall be given more abundantly, even power. Wherefore confound your enemies, call upon them to meet you, both in public and in private. And inasmuch as ye are faithful, their shame shall be made manifest. Wherefore let them bring forth their strong reasons against the Lord. Verily thus saith the Lord unto you, there is no weapon that is formed against you shall prosper." Footnote 7 to this clarifies this weaponry language. It says, according to Webster's 1828 dictionary, a weapon was, quote, anything used or designed to be used in destroying or annoying an enemy, unquote. Booth's letters could fit such a description. So that's the idea of like, weapon, yeah, well, a letter in this case, yes, could be a weapon. And this is one of those things where, and I will say that, maybe without calling it a debate or anything like that, this is something that the church is very much a part of currently, which is, let's do it in public, let's do it up front, let's do it openly. We're not going to do this in a dark corner. And it's kind of funny because some people actually find that to be kind of boring. It's like, there's no, exciting things. No, like if the church has something that they're going to change, just like it did back then, that's going to do it very openly. It's going to publish it. It's going to kind of make it available to all. So they took that challenge, and apparently the other people did not. So Ezra and Sidmonds failed to show up to that debate. So there you go. So that's section 71. Section 72, a little bit more complicated. Section 72 is actually 3 revelations put together. Once again, we get amens, and those amens indicate that that particular revelation is done. So in my efforts as an amateur historian, I try to kind of pull all of the information together about all 3 of these parts so that we weren't repeating ourselves over and over again. And here we go. So wish me luck on this one. This one's kind of a tough one. So there's 3 parts again. All of these given on the same day. This is the 4th of December, 1831. And this is the last document in 1831. So this is the last thing that we get. And we don't have any meetings of notes or anything like that from these other December meetings that happened, but this is all we have. So big year 1831, and it ends here. This is all, again, part of the same bundle of papers that we get in the New OK Whitney papers, these loose papers that were folded up and carried. It includes, which again, includes previous revelations. So this is 71, 72 are both in this stack. We also get a copy of this found in Hyde Smith's notebook, which the handwriting starts with Samuel Smith, and then Orson Hyde, takes over on the 3rd page of this portion. And he does, again, have a much smaller handwriting size, a much smaller font than Orson does. So I always have this vision of like, man, you're taking up a lot of pages, and he takes over and it's like way smaller. But we also get a copy in that. There's also a copy found in Revelation Book 1. This is the handwriting of John Whitmer. We get some minor grammatical changes in John Whitmer's own handwriting, and then there's this adhesive that's found in the pages, and it's since been separated, and we are not exactly sure what was there, but something was sort of adhered there. There were these sort of adhesive wafers that they would use to, it was pre-tape, right? Was on there, but we just don't know what it was. There's also a copy found in Revelation Book 2. This is Frederick G. Williams' handwriting. However, most of the revelation of this, again, this is 3 parts, is actually written in Joseph Smith Jr.'s own hand. And take a look at how accurate and clean this writing is. With a few exceptions, of course. There's a few things here and there. But just to kind of point out, like, here's a kid who did not get educated very well. We've seen his handwriting in the past. It's a little bit of a mess. His spelling's not quite there. This is a major thing. So to kind of point out that Joseph Smith Jr., this prophet of the church and everything, was working on his penmanship, on his writing, on his reading. He really applied himself quite a lot, just personally on these things. And later on, once we get into places like Nauvoo, he starts learning other languages. So this is a very, very self-motivated guy. But I just thought it was interesting. This is probably some of the cleanest handwriting you're going to get from Joseph Smith, which was interesting. We also get a copy that was found in the Evening and Morning Star in 2 different editions, actually. One in 1832, and again, it's published in 1835. We also get some loose page from a hand that we don't know. So there's a whole document here. It says, recorded in Doctrine and Covenants, section 72, and somebody else's handwriting we also don't know. We don't know who wrote this, but we have it, and it is authentic. So that's another page that we have. The 1835 Doctrine and Covenants calls this section 89, not section 72. And we get a copy in the manuscript history, which leads us to section heading differences, pretty big ones here between the two. So section heading in 1981 for this section says, several elders and members had assembled to learn their duty and to be further edified in the teachings of the church. This section is a compilation of 2 revelations received on the same day. Verses 1 through 8 make known the calling of Newell K. Whitney as a bishop. He was then called and ordained, after which verses 9 through 26 were received, giving additional information as to a bishop's duties. So, 2013, we get a lot of the same. And then it says, this section is a compilation of 3 revelations received on the same day. Verses 1 through 8 make known the calling of Newell K. Whitney as a bishop. He was then called and ordained, after which verses 9 through 23 were received, giving additional information as to a bishop's duties. Thereafter, verses 24 through 26 were given, providing instructions concerning the gathering to Zion. And may I suggest, and this is one of the reasons why we feel, the church, what am I talking about? They that did the Joseph Smith Wafers feels that this might be an original, because this section is all about Newell K. Whitney, and there's a good chance that Sidney Rigdon wrote these down and handed it to him, and that is the most original copy you get. So this is kind of an exciting section here. But what's interesting, and these are the kind of major changes, is when we discover, past 1981 in 2013, that actually we're looking at 3 different revelations here instead of 2. And there's a lot more clarification about why it was given and where it was and all this kind of stuff. So a big shout out to the church for receiving the scholarship of its historians here. So, circumstantial introduction to section 72. The original document simply just gives Kirtland, December 4th, 1831. Hayden Smith's notework gives a little bit more. It says, a commandment concerning a bishop being chosen and given in Hiram, December 4th, 1831. Okay. Revelation Book 2 doesn't really give that much. Not much given in the Evening and Morning Star, the Doctrine and Covenants, and this unidentified scribe copy. It doesn't really give us a whole lot as far as an introduction is concerned. The manuscript history gives us this. Knowing now the mind of the Lord, that the time had come that the gospel should be proclaimed in power and demonstration to the world, from the scriptures, reasoning as with men, as in days of old, I took a journey to Kirtland in company with Elder Sidney Rigdon on the 3rd day of December to fulfill the above revelation. On the 4th, several of the elders and brethren members assembled together to learn their duty and for edification. and after some time had been spent in conversing about our temporal and spiritual welfare, I received the following. And if you know anything about bishops, temporal and spiritual welfare is definitely the main topic of what a bishop does. So now we're into Documents Volume 2. The historical introduction to this says, this revelation and the two that follow were all dictated on the 4th of December, 1831, in the same setting. On the 3rd of December, 1831, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon traveled to Kirtland from Hiram, Ohio, to fulfill a commandment given on a 1st December revelation to preach unto the world in the regions round about and in the church. According to a later Joseph Smith history, on the 4th, several of the elders and members assembled together to learn their duty and for edification. A gathering described in the Revelation as a conference of high priests. Minutes of this meeting are not extant, but the Joseph Smith history notes that it included conversations about, quote, our temporal and spiritual welfare. Joseph Smith and Rigdon may have also instructed the elders on the need to counter the published criticism of former church member Ezra Booth. So this Ezra Booth fellow and his letters are a major reason why we have a lot of publication and a lot of evangelizing what these callings mean and what we need to do about it, which I think is good. I think it's good to say, like, hey, there's some criticism coming. We're going to take it seriously. We're going to do something about it. We're going to ask questions about it, which is really admirable about these early saints, is that they were like, I don't know, let's ask. That's kind of cool. We don't really know the circumstances of these revelations, and the historical introduction gives us this. Because no minutes of the 4th December conference exist, it is difficult to determine the exact circumstances under which these revelations were dictated. Conference attendees may have decided before the first revelation was dictated, possibly in connection with their conversation on temporal and spiritual welfare, to appoint a bishop for Ohio. If so, the first revelation apparently affirmed this decision, since it told the assembled high priests that in this thing ye have done wisely. The revelation then identified Whitney as the man appointed. And again, these are 3 texts. So further into this introduction, when the 3 4th December revelations were published, they were presented as a single combined text, but manuscript copies indicate they were originally 3 separate dictated texts. And the manuscript editions actually give these very clear endings. So more from this introduction, a copy of these 2 revelations made by Joseph Smith and Frederick G. Williams in Revelation Book 2 around March 1832 supports this assessment. A clear break exists in the text between the first and second revelations, and a new heading with a date appears before the second revelation. The table of contents to Revelation Book 2 also treats these as 2 separate 4th December revelations, referring to one as, quote, a revelation given to choose a bishop, and the other as, quote, also another in addition to the law, making known the duty of the bishop. Furthermore, other early manuscript copies, including the copy held by Whitney, preface the second revelation with the heading, quote, the duty of the bishop as made known at the same time, unquote. Although there is not a similar break or heading in the manuscript copies before the third revelation, it too appears to be separate. The second revelation ends with the words, quote, and now I make an end of my sayings, amen, unquote, indicating the formal closure of a discrete revelation text. And is this the original copy? Well, the historical introduction says this about that. Sidney Rigdon probably served as the original scribe for these 3 revelations. The copy featured here, which is in Rigdon's handwriting and was held by Whitney, may be the original manuscript. So take a good look at this and just see, errors, changes, so forth and so on. I know that there are some stories about how when Joseph Smith dictated revelations like this, I can't imagine that it maybe made a whole lot of sense. I don't think it was a string of thoughts. It almost seems to me like he would say a few words, they would say, okay, got it, and then he would say a few more words, and then, okay, and that way they could very clearly get it. Either that or maybe he did just say the whole thing. I'm not sure. But anyway, just something to think about. So further to this, the other two revelations explained how Whitney's duties as bishop were closely related to those of Edward Partridge. Partridge was responsible for dividing the land of Zion for inheritances, and Whitney was to provide recompense to those who had been faithful in their stewardships and had been designated to go to Missouri. And there you go. Now, footnotes and content for this first portion, there's 3 parts here. So parts, kind of verses 1 through 8, as we now have it, mostly just scriptural references. So we're going to pass over that for the sake of time. Footnotes and content for part 2. So this would be, as you see now, verses 9 through 23. The text, one footnote that's interesting, in the text we get, the duty of the bishop which has been ordained unto the church in this part of the vineyard, which is verily this, to keep the Lord's storehouse, to receive the funds of the church in this part of the vineyard. So footnote 3 for this says, a May 1831 revelation told the bishop to appoint a storehouse unto this church, and let all things, both in money and in meat, which is more than is needful for the want of this people, be kept in the hands of the bishop. Unquote. The Lord's storehouse in Kirtland, Ohio, was apparently to be Newell K. Whitney's own store, which she was commanded in August 1831 to, quote, retain for a little season. So 2 things about this. Number 1, it was just Newell K. Whitney's store. That's where things were had. So very practical that way. The other thing I just want to point out is that when you're talking about money and meat, what you're actually talking about is general food. This is sort of an old language of just, wheat is considered meat, and meat is considered meat. But it's not just flesh, for example. So basically, money and food, things that are practical, held in a store that they already had. Very interesting. We also get from the text, to take an account of the elders as before, has been commanded, and to administer to their wants, who shall pay for that which they receive. And footnote 4 to this, because that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, says, the previous commandment referenced here may be either the revelation given earlier in the day or a February 1831 revelation in which the bishop was charged with the responsibility of supporting the families of elders, quote, out of the property which is consecrated unto the church, unquote. So when missionaries would go out, right, if you were an elder and you were called to leave and do something, whether it was preaching or anything else, it was the job of the bishop to make sure that those families were taken care of, that the maybe wife, children, whatever dependents that they may have were actually taken care of. And I would argue that this is a very strong thing to this day with nearly every religion that I know of. I mean, there's definitely some responsibility for the church since we're calling them out to actually take care of them. So I thought that was very interesting. Further into it, we get, quote, administering the gospel, and the things of the kingdom unto the church and unto the world shall answer the debt unto the bishop in Zion. Footnote 5 to this says, the president of the high priesthood, who had not yet been appointed, which I thought was really interesting, was to have responsibility for the administering of ordinances and blessings upon the church, in contrast with the bishop, who had the task of administering all temporal things. So this is something that we understand now, but I just thought this was fascinating that there still was no president of the high priesthood yet. You'd think like, oh, well, let's make it Joseph. No, they still hadn't quite done this yet. Again, they were very meticulous about this and treated it very much like business. So I was like, oh yeah, right. We don't have basically what we call a first presidency yet. That didn't exist back then at this time, which I just thought was very interesting. And again, and we have this today where you have the first presidency in the 12th, and a lot of that is administering the entire church, but specifically the spiritual things. And then there's a presiding bishopric today, and they deal with all of the temporal stuff. This is tithing, this is buildings, this is all the temporal things of the church. So that still stands today. The revelation further gives to us, and again, let my servants who are appointed as stewards over the literary concerns of my church have claim for assistance in all things upon the bishop or bishops in all things, that the revelations may be published and go forth unto the ends of the earth, that they may obtain funds which shall benefit the church in all things, that they also may render themselves approved in all things and be accounted as wise stewards. Lots of all things there. What does this mean? Well, this is kind of the operation of the church for quite a long time. I think it was a little further into the 20th century where we stopped doing this, and I'll explain in a second, but this is footnote 8. In November 1831, Revelation appointed Joseph Smith, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, John Whitmer, Sidney Rigdon, and William W. Phelps, quote, stewards over the revelations and commandments, unquote. They had the responsibility of managing the publication of the revelations and, quote, the profits thereof, which they could use for their necessities and their wants. Anything left over was to be placed in the storehouse, and the benefits thereof shall be consecrated unto the inhabitants of Zion and unto their generations. So we did a big thing where we sold. In fact, the church made a lot of money that they needed by selling Revelations and Commandments. You would sell a copy of the Book of Mormon. You would sell maybe, I mean, this probably never happened because it was destroyed, but the Book of Commandments, I think that was probably what they were anticipating, or selling the Doctrine and Covenants. Today, what's interesting is that the Book of Mormon, there's a fund for just publishing books, and we give them away for free now. There's no charge for that. But for a very long time, you sold the books, and in the case especially of Martin Harris, he got to keep some of those profits for himself, especially since he mortgaged his property. So, something to think about there. In the text further on, we get, and behold, this shall be an ensample for all the extensive branches of my church, in whatsoever land they shall be established. And now I make an end of my sayings. Amen. Footnote 9 to this says, a copy of the revelation made by Frederick G. Williams and Joseph Smith in Revelation Book 2 includes at this time here in Joseph Smith's handwriting. So I make an end of my sayings at this time. Amen is what we currently have. And that edition was given by Joseph Smith. Okay, so part 3. This is verses 24 through 26. I'll just give you the whole thing. It just says, a few words in addition to the laws of the kingdom respecting the members of the church, they who are appointed by the Holy Spirit to go up unto Zion, and they who are privileged to go up unto Zion, let them carry up unto the bishop a certificate from the 3 elders of the church, or a certificate from the bishop otherwise. He shall go up unto the land of Zion, shall not be accounted worthy a wise steward. This also is an ensample. Amen. And this is the one and only footnote we get for this little portion. It says, none were to go to Zion except those who were appointed. On August 1831, Revelation stated that the elders should desire through prayer to go to Zion, where they would receive an inheritance, but this gathering needed to be done as it shall be counseled by the elders of the church at the conferences. Another revelation explained that Joseph Smith would have power, that he shall be enabled to discern by the Spirit those who shall go up unto the land of Zion, and those of my disciples that shall tarry. A very interesting thing here about the theology of Latter-day Saints is that this idea that you can desire something through prayer to do something. But again, we're going to go through the open door here, wide open in the front. It's, elders, church at conferences, people will come together and do this. So somebody may really want something really badly, but they're still going to have to go through sort of the church as a whole so that everything is done in order. And not just everybody got to go to Zion, only those who were assigned to go could go. So there was a lot of control, I would say a lot of thought and planning that went into this, because you're talking about lands and houses. That's quite a lot to deal with people. So that is part 1. Section 71 and 72. 72 is a little, like I said, complicated. We're going to get that same thing in a later section here today. And also going to go a little out of order, so stay tuned for part 2. All right, we're going to barrel along into part 2. We're going to go a little out of order as it reads today. We're actually going to only be talking about sections 73 and 75. Section 74 is way out of chronological context here, so I'm going to give it its own space. So a paper's introduction into section 73. Again, this is the same copy that we get with section 72 and the section 71. All this handwriting of Sidney Rigdon, the Newell K. Whitney papers, these loose stack of papers that we get. It's part of that little stack there. On the back of this page, it shows, in very nice handwriting, I might add, Newell K. Whitney, N.K. Whitney is written there. And also, it is written, command to elders what to do till conference. There you go. And that looks like in graphite or pencil, as we would say. We also get a copy found in Revelation Book 1. very little correction on this text. What we do get on the title here, which is interesting, is you get read or read on the left side, and then on the right side it says read and compared. So what I believe this means is, yeah, we've gone through this and it's been verified and we're ready to produce it or publish it, I guess, is what I'm assuming it means by that. It is section 29 in the original Doctrine and Covenants. There is a manuscript history copy, and there are no changes in the modern section heading. So pretty clean here for us, for our purposes here today. So circumstantially to this, the original copy, very brief, it just says Hiram, Portage County, Ohio, January 10th, 1832. So hallelujah, we have made it beyond 1831, and we're in a whole new year. That was a huge year, like really, really big. So glad that's behind us, but that was quite a lot of what we have here. Okay, so I would argue in the way that they've done this in the original copy that when it says, quote, a revelation to Joseph and Sidney Rigdon, the word of the Lord unto them concerning the elders of the church of the living God, established in the last days, making known the will of the Lord unto the elders, what they shall do until conference, I think, is also an introduction to the text, and some others agree with me. So we don't get a revelation number, actually, in Revelation Book 1. We just get that read, or read, if you will, word over there. But we do get a revelation given Hiram, Portage County, Ohio, January 10th, 1832. Now, the original Doctrine and Covenants actually agrees with me. Thank you very much. And it says, quote, a revelation to Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon, January 1832. The word of the Lord unto them concerning the elders of the church of the living God, established in the last days, making known the will of the Lord unto the elders, what they shall do until conference. So, thank you, Doctrine and Covenants. Not only did you finally give me something to talk about, but yeah, we're on the same page there. So, manuscript history for this gives a little more. It says, from this time until the 8th or 10th of January, 1832, myself and Elder Sidney Rigdon continued to preach in Shalersville, Ravenna, and other places, setting forth the truth, vindicating the cause of our Redeemer, shewing that the days of vengeance was coming upon this generation like a thief in the night, that prejudice, blindness, and darkness filled the minds of many, and caused them to persecute the true church and reject the true light, by which means we did much towards allaying the excited feelings which were growing out of the scandalous letters then being published in the Ohio Star at Ravenna by the before-mentioned apostate Ezra Booth. On the 10th of January, 1832, I received the following. And so this, again, this is a little after the challenge was thrown down, the gauntlet was thrown down, perhaps. And again, Ezra Booth, Sidney's writer, didn't show up. So they preached anyway. They did the best they could, and apparently they made some progress. So there you go. So Documents Volume 2, the historical introduction to this, gives us Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon's preaching, as well as that of other elders sent from Kirtland, was intended in part to combat misinformation and criticism published by former church member Ezra Booth in the Ohio Star, following instructions in the December Revelations to call upon church critics to meet you both in public and in private. Rigdon challenged Booth and Sidney's writer, a former member in Hiram, to defend their claims against the church in public, but neither man accepted. According to a later Joseph Smith history, these efforts did much towards allaying the excited feelings that stemmed from Booth's influence. Joseph Smith and Rigdon returned to Hiram, Ohio around 8th of January, 1832, and on 10th of January, Joseph Smith dictated this revelation, quote, making known the will of the Lord, regarding what they and the elders should do until the next conference, which was held 2 weeks later. In addition to instructing Joseph Smith, Rigdon, and other elders to continue preaching, the revelation directed Joseph Smith and Rigdon to renew their work on the Bible revision after the conclusion of the upcoming conference. So once again, a pause. Please stop revising, go preach, and then come back. But what's interesting about this is, as much as I've read it up to this point, it's always like, you can keep doing this or keep doing that, but you got to keep preaching. You got to keep preaching along the way. You got to keep going. You got to keep going. That never ends. That never stops. And finally, from the historical introduction, we get Joseph Smith probably dictated this revelation to Rigdon in an upstairs bedroom of the John and Alice Johnson home, where they worked on the Bible revision. A copy of the revelation inscribed by Rigdon was provided to Newell K. Whitney and the newly appointed bishop in Kirtland, perhaps shortly thereafter. The revelation's instructions to the elders preaching in the area were probably spread through other copies or by word of mouth, which is kind of the best you could do. They would write maybe out a few copies here and there, or they would just read it out loud to people. That's how they did it. And so this stack of papers that we're getting all these sections from is an example of that. Footnote 7 to this introduction, actually, says Rigdon wrote N.K. Whitney, Kirtland, Ohio, on the back of this revelation. That this document was marked as being intended for Whitney suggests that it was a copy, not the original. The replacement in the body of the initial inscription of "it is expedient," a later phrase in the revelation, with "it is practicable," is apparently the correction of a copying error, which also suggests that this document is a copy. Just a little bit of the forensics about why do we think this is original or a copy or the first version of it. There's a lot of those little details that the editors of the Joseph Smith papers used to determine this stuff, so it's kind of fun. All right, so not a whole lot of footnotes and context to this, but we do get one, which is interesting. So from the revelation we get, "Now verily I say unto you, unto my servants, Joseph and Sidney, saith the Lord, it is expedient to translate again, and inasmuch as it is expedient, practicable to preach in the regions round about until conference." So do your revision, but keep preaching. Footnote 4, by 20 November, when John Whitmer left Ohio for Missouri, Joseph Smith's revision of the Bible was completed at least through Mark 9:1, Mark chapter 9, verse 1, at which point the handwriting changes from Whitmer's to Rigdon's. By 16 February 1832, Joseph Smith was reviewing John chapter 5. And all the other references we have are just spiritual citations. But I just thought that was interesting. Like, they really went right away. Oh, there's a revelation. Okay, John, stand aside. Rigdon's going to keep going at it. And you can see that in the revisions of the Bible, which is kind of fun. So there you go. That is section 73. We're going to skip section 74 just for a moment in this part, and we're going to talk about section 75. So again, the most original is from the same stack of papers from the Newell K. Whitney papers, handwriting of Sidney Rigdon. So again, the fold marks are all the same. Everything's the same. Two sections are on two separate pages, actually. But all of it come from the same collection belonging to Whitney. So once again, section 75, two different revelations that were given at the same time and were merged together. And we'll see that in a moment. It's very prominent in the later copies that we get. So we do get a copy in the Smith and Hyde notebook, handwriting of Orson Hyde the whole way this time. And the rest of it, or what we call part 2 now, is actually not even here, right? So the first portion of this revelation, all the way up to the first amen, if you will, is in Revelation, or is in the Hyde and Smith notebook. And it looks like they kind of wrote that down and then ran off with it, and, they didn't get the second part. So the copy that we get out of Revelation book 1 is actually underneath a crossed out section, which we now call section 82. So you'll notice there's a little X through there. That was originally section 82, which apparently was not intended to be originally printed, but we do have it today. So that's what that crossout is. It is in the handwriting of John Whitmer. What we get is a lot of last name additions. So these are a lot of people being called on missions. There's verse numbering by W.W. Phelps, but he also adds in these last names. Now, in the past, what you may have noticed is that Joseph Smith is usually the one doing this. So for some reason, William W. Phelps took that over. What we do get is another revelation received at the same time and place, which is the rest of section 75. Connected, you see here, is written on the side by W.W. Phelps. And and then it keeps the last names going in the verse numbering. So it's kind of fun how they say, like, yeah, these are two separate revelations, but I love how he kind of spans connected across the two, and very, very illustrative and helpful, I'm sure, to publishers. It is section 87 in the Doctrine and Covenants, the original version, and it is in the manuscript history. And we do get section heading changes today. So 1981 says, "The occasion was that of a conference previously appointed. At this conference, Joseph Smith was sustained and ordained president of the high priesthood." We finally get to that. Certain elders who had encountered difficulty in bringing men to an understanding of their message desired to learn more in detail as to their immediate duties. This revelation followed. And the 2013 edition of this, again, a little different because of the Joseph Smith papers and other things, says, this section comprises two separate revelations. The first in verses 1 through 22, the second in verses 23 through 36, given on the same day. The occasion was a conference at which Joseph Smith was sustained and ordained president of the high priesthood. Certain elders desired to learn more about their immediate duties. These revelations followed. So this is a pretty big day. We finally get a first president. So if you're curious about when did we start getting first presidents, this is it. And this is the 25th of January, 1832. That's the first time you have something called a first presidents officially. So no counselors, no so forth and so on. That sort of evolved later. But we finally fulfilled that little portion of the Articles and Covenants and the law and all that, where you have to have a president of the high priesthood. So it's interesting to me that it took this long to get there because we're in 1832 now. But anyway, no criticism. I'm just the amateur historian. So circumstantial introductions to section 75, we actually get nothing whatsoever in the New K. Whitney papers. So that stack, we get nothing in it. Smith and Hyde's notebook just gives us a commandment given to 10 elders. That's it. So at least we know how many people were there, or at least we think. Revelation Book 1 notes this as 79. Says a revelation given at Amherst in a conference held there to 10 elders, January 25th, 1832. And there's not much in the Doctrine and Covenants. The manuscript history does give, a few days before the conference was to commence in Amherst, Lorain County, I started in company with the elders that lived in my own vicinity and arrived in due time. At this conference, much harmony prevailed, and considerable business was done to advance the kingdom and promulgate the gospel to the inhabitants of the surrounding country. The elders seemed anxious for me to inquire of the Lord, that they might know his will, or learn what would be most pleasing to him for them to do, in order to bring men to a sense of their condition. For as it was written, all men had gone out of the way, so that none doeth good, no, not one. As it was written, all men have gone out of the way. I inquired and received the following. And so that's what we get from the manuscript history, again, kind of written in the first person of Joseph Smith, but he didn't actually write those words down himself. Those were sort of dictations as he gave this history later on in life. So Documents Volume 2 gives us a lot more in the historical introduction. It says, Joseph Smith dictated this revelation and the one that follows at a general conference in Amherst, Ohio, 50 miles west of Kirtland, Ohio, on the 25th of January, 1832. On 10th of January, 1832, a revelation stated that the next conference, the several missions the elders were to fulfill would be made known unto them. William E. McClellan later wrote that the 25th of January conference was attended by between 70 and 80 official characters, apparently men who held church offices, from various locations. Minutes of the conference, if kept, are not extant, but a later Joseph Smith history recounts that a considerable business was done to advance the kingdom. This included the licensing of one or more elders, the appointment of Orson Pratt as the president of the elders, and ordaining of Joseph Smith as the president of the high priesthood. Following instruction in the November 1831 revelation that one be appointed to that office. So I guess you get the first elders quorum president, if we want to call it that today, plus the first president of the church, the president of the high priesthood. There you go. We get a couple of missionary calls out of this. So the historical introduction continues. The 25th January revelations indicate that the men appointed to missions were ones who volunteered to preach, but earlier instructions suggested that proselyting was a duty rather than a choice for faithful elders. The minutes of an October 1831 conference noted that the Spirit declared that proclaiming the gospel and warning the inhabitants of the earth of the things known in the Church of Christ in these last days was one of the elders' duties. That, my friends, is very much a thing today. If you are an ordained elder in the Melchizedek priesthood, it is, and the church preaches this to the young men, like it is a duty for you to go on your missions. So that's a thing to this day. Missionary preparations happened here, which I thought was really interesting. So, historical introduction again says most of the individuals mentioned in this 25th January revelation attended an October 1831 conference. At that conference, several brethren were called by the clerk who were desirous to preach the gospel, and Joseph Smith examined them for fitness to be ordained. These men were likely the ones assigned in this revelation to preach. Is that your missionary interview process? Like, what does that mean, fitness? Like, can you walk? Can you preach? Are you in good standing? I don't know what that means. I think it's really interesting that even back then, it wasn't like, oh, you're going to go and you just go. They would actually, like, Joseph Smith apparently would examine them somehow for fitness to be ordained. So maybe that's interviews, maybe it's something else, but I thought that was interesting. Anyway. So when was this all given? Well, historical introduction. A reminiscence written by Pratt, for example, states that a revelation was written in the presence of the whole assembly on the 25th of January. Edison Barney, who was also present, recalled that Sidney Rigdon inscribed the revelation text as Joseph Smith pronounced it on that day. In both of these accounts, it is unclear whether the author is referring to just one or to both of the 25th January revelations. Further to this, when John Whitmer copied both revelations into Revelation Book 1, he introduced the second as another revelation received at the same time and place. Upon their publication in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, however, the revelations were combined into a single text, a pattern followed in subsequent publications. So it's never not been published together. But we're not exactly sure kind of what the circumstances were. Just we're taking these from reminiscence from other people. So some content and footnotes from the revelation itself we get. Therefore, verily I say unto my servant William E. McClellan, I revoke the commission which I gave unto him to go unto the eastern countries. And I give unto him for a new commission and a new commandment, in the which I the Lord chasteneth him for the murmurings of his heart. And he sinned, nevertheless I forgive him, and say unto him again, go ye into the south countries. So what's this all about? A little bit of a rebuke here. Footnote 8 shares that Samuel Smith was called on a mission, quote, about a month later. However, they had to discontinue their work. As Samuel Smith wrote, quote, because of disobedience, our way was hedged up before us. Brother William was taken sick, and I returned about the 25th of December, 1831. Smith's meaning is not entirely clear. He may have meant that some kind of disobedience, perhaps mere reluctance to preach, led to the failure of the mission, which was followed by McClellan's illness. Or he may have been implying that some kind of disobedience led to McClellan's illness, which in itself then halted the work. Joseph Smith visited the bedridden McClellan on the 28th of December. McClellan wrote that he was healed by Joseph Smith and returned with him to Hiram the next day. So it's not all chastening and nasty stuff. Apparently, Joseph actually came to him, gave him a blessing. He was healed and apparently then got himself chewed out in a revelation. So standing chastened. Although I kind of wonder if that language would have been harsh back then. It might have just been like, hey, man, like, you messed up. Let's move on, like really gentle. Who knows? Anyway, further into the text we get, in whatsoever house ye enter, and they receive you, leave your blessings upon that house. And in whatsoever house ye enter, and they receive you not, ye shall depart speedily from that house, and shake off the dust of your feet as a testimony against them. And you shall be filled with joy and gladness, and know this, that in the day of judgment you shall be judges of that house and condemn them, and it shall be more tolerable for the heathen in the day of judgment than for that house. Yeesh. Footnote 14 to this says, a revelation dated July 1830 gave this same admonition, telling Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery that when their testimony was rejected, they were to leave a cursing instead of a blessing by casting off the dust of your feet against them as a testimony. And this is a kind of harsh language, but it's this idea of like, hey, we did all that we could. You know, people do this all the time, this motion that I'm doing here. My hands are clean. I'm done, you know. Again, there was an episode with the Campbellites, and I think it was Orson Pratt did this and took it a little too far and caused a bit of a problem. Anyway, careful when you dust, maybe, is the theme here. So the content also states to us, and again, verily I say unto you, that every man who is obliged to provide for his own family, let him provide, and he shall in no wise lose his crown, and let him labor in the church. Some of these missionaries actually kept close to home so that they could continue to care for their families. I found this very interesting. It wasn't just, they weren't just cast off to the farthest reaches. Some of them would come back. So footnote 3 from part 2 of this revelation says this. This apparently meant that those whose families might suffer in their absence would be allowed to preach in the vicinity of their own homes. Eden Smith, for example, continued to preach in the vicinity of Northampton, Ohio, returning after week-long trips to labor at home, as he wrote, quote, for the support of my family. This may also explain why these men, in contrast to those called in the earlier 25th of January 1832 revelation, were not assigned to travel in any specific direction. So I find this interesting that one way to interpret it mattereth not where you go, or go where you got to go. Might have just been like, hey, if you just need to stay close to home, why don't you leave for a few days? You can come back. You can continue taking care of your family. We're good. Okay, I'm going to leave again for a few days and do my mission. Very interesting. We definitely don't do that today. But I just find it interesting that they would make that sort of a concession, because back then it's like if you weren't laboring all the time, you didn't eat. I mean, that was just the nature of it. So there's part 2 for you, sections 73 and 75. We're going to get into section 74, which is actually an explanation, not necessarily termed a revelation or a commandment like the others. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, we'll get you on your way. This is actually from a very much earlier text that we're going to go from. So we're going to give it its own part. Stick around. All right, part 3, our final part for the day. We're going to go back one. We're going to go to section 74, which is out of order in a big way. So the most original copy of this that we get is from Revelation Book 1. This is in the handwriting of John Whitmer, and it is called An Explanation. Very interesting. It also says, John Whitmer and William W. Phelps' handwriting says not to be printed, and then it says for the covenants. So I take that to mean don't put it in the Book of Commandments, but do put it in the Doctrine and Covenants. So take that as you will. And there's actually very little else besides punctuation and capitalization of grammar that we get here. We get the same thing twice, and this is interesting to me. Like Revelation Book 2, the exact same thing is there twice. It's in Frederick G. Williams' handwriting, and it's only verses 2 through 7 of section 74. So there you go. It is actually called section 73 in the original Doctrine and Covenants. So that is the for the covenants part. It's in the manuscript history, and then we do get some section heading differences again here. It says in 1981, the prophet writes, upon the reception of the foregoing word of the Lord, which is Doctrine and Covenants, section 73, I recommenced the translation of the scriptures and labored diligently until just before the conference, which was to convene on the 25th of January. During this period, I also received the following as an explanation of 1 Corinthians 7:14. The 2013 edition says, even before the organization of the church, questions had arisen about the proper mode of baptism, leading the prophet to seek answers on the subject. Joseph Smith History writes that this revelation is an explanation of 1 Corinthians 7:14, a scripture that had often been used to justify infant baptism. So what is 1 Corinthians 7:14? This is an entire section that is just explaining one verse. And the verse is this. It says, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. And apparently this was up for some pretty serious debate in the 1830s as to what this verse means. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But just so you know, that's the context. It's kind of a short verse, but that's a whole explanation just on it. And there's actually a little bit of a throwback to a guy that we thought just kind of came and went. But apparently we do get a whole other section of the Doctrine and Covenants from this. And this is why the timing is weird. Anyway, we'll get to it in a second. So the circumstantial introduction into this section, Revelation Book 1 gives an explanation of the first epistle to the First Corinthians, 7th chapter and 14th verse, given to Joseph the seer at Wayne County, New York, 1830. Revelation Book 2, the first version of Revelation Book 2 gives an explanation of the 14th verse of 7th chapter of the First Corinthians. Okay. Second, Revelation Book 2, it's the same thing. I don't know why they copied it twice, but that's what they did. Doctrine and Covenants is the same. It just says an explanation of the epistle of 1 Corinthians, 7th chapter, 14th verse. So it actually does sort of spell it out there. Okay, so the manuscript history. What do we get from Joseph's own words, if you will? Upon the reception of the foregoing word of the Lord, I recommenced the translation of the scriptures and labored diligently until just about the first before the conference, which was to commence on the 25th of January. During this period, I also received the following as an explanation of the epistle to the 1 Corinthians, 7th chapter, 14th verse. So, the historical introduction to this is from documents that the Joseph Smith Papers editors have put this together. It says, this explanation clarifies a New Testament verse, 1 Corinthians 7:14, if I haven't said that 7,000 times yet, which historically had been an important passage for justifying infant baptism. Like the Book of Mormon, this document rejects the need for infant baptism by explaining that little children are made clean through the atonement of Jesus Christ without baptism. Although it is possible that questions regarding 1 Corinthians 7:14 or infant baptisms prompted this explanation, the precise circumstances are unknown, and we don't know when it was given. So the introduction says this: the date the document was produced is also uncertain. When John Whitmer copied the document into Revelation Book 1 in 1831, he simply dated it 1830. However, he placed it between documents dated 6 January 1831 and 4th of February 1831. The editors of the Book of Commandments did not include this document with Joseph Smith's printed Revelations in 1833, when it was included in the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835. No date was mentioned. Years later, the editors of Joseph Smith's history mistakenly wrote that Joseph Smith dictated this document in January of 1832 in conjunction with his version of the New Testament. So what we had for a long time was wrong. But the location, which Whitmer identified as Wayne County, New York, indicates that the document was created before Joseph Smith moved to Ohio in the second half of January 1831, and that it could have been written as early as January of 1830. So it could be basically 2 years previous to it, or at least a year previous to what we thought for a long time based on the manuscript history. And this, my friends, is one of the reasons why I think the church made these changes to the section headings, is because that's kind of a big difference there. So a footnote in the introduction, which I think is interesting, says, according to one modern theologian, quote, with the exception of the scripture passage where Jesus blesses little children, no passage has been laid under a more laborious contribution to serve the cause of infant baptism than this one, unquote. The topic of infant baptism was also prevalent in Christian debates during Joseph Smith's time. So apparently, and this is what was interesting, and I'm kind of amalgamating this, James Covell, or James Colville, if you will, the very, very short-lived convert that may have been a part of the an impetus for receiving this revelation, based on his views of infant baptism. So we know that Sidney Rigdon was very much opposed to this. That was kind of a Campbellite thing. But when James Colville shows up, apparently he was a little bit more in favor of doing something like infant baptism. What does it mean? How does baptism work? And all this kind of stuff. And prompted this idea of like, well, once they got to that scripture and they were debating on it, and Joseph Smith is doing a revision, that this explanation shows up. So I thought those were really interesting. So James, even though you were here and gone, thank you for at least prompting that. That's our best guess, maybe. A guess. My guess. I'm not sure. So for content and footnotes, we only really get scriptural references to this particular one in the document series. And so there's not really a whole lot to do. So to give in summary, I just wanted to point out because we're talking so much about this, what's the conclusion for those of you listening who may not have read this before? Just the last portion of it says this. The apostle, who in this case is Paul, wrote unto the church, giving unto them a commandment, not of the Lord, but of himself, that a believer should not be united to an unbeliever, except the law of Moses should be done away among them, that their children might remain without circumcision, and that the tradition might be done away, which saith that little children are unholy, for it was had among the Jews. But little children are holy, being sanctified through the atonement of Jesus Christ. And this is what the scriptures mean. That is the conclusion of this. So basically, what I'm trying to show here is apparently Paul was kind of giving this as like an admonition from himself, not necessarily from God, but by saying like you're kind of mess your kids up a little bit by teaching them this stuff, which is I guess outdated at the time. But and this is a big belief of this church as well as many others, as well as we get this from the Book of Mormon, not just from the Doctrine and Covenants. Little children do not need to be baptized. Specifically in our religion, the age of 8 is the earliest that somebody can be baptized, which leads to a very interesting idea that no one's born Mormon. I mean, you can call it that because it's easier for the sake of conversation, but no, you can be a child of record, like we know about you, that you're born into this family that are members of the church, but you are not a member of the church until you are 8. And the only thing that really keeps you a member of the church, because you can be excommunicated or expelled, is your ability to keep covenants or, not do anything naughty, I guess, to put it silly. But anyway, so that's section 74, and that is our episode for today. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next time with a big one. This is section 76, or the vision. This is where there's a major depart from traditional Christian theology, what we call the plan of salvation, a really, really big one. So I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully we'll see you there. And until then, this is the Amateur Historian saying, have a good week.